Hello, I'm Judith Johnson, and this is Humans of Clinical Academia, a Manchester Catalys podcast. Every episode, we invite a leading clinical academic to share 5 images that reflect key moments in their lives and careers. We do this over a drink of their choice. We describe these images in the audio version of the podcast, but head over to our YouTube channel and our Instagram channel if you want to see them for yourself. My guest this week is Professor John Baker, Chair in Mental Health Nursing. John first completed a 4-year Bachelor of Nursing degree at the University of Manchester. He then began his career as a registered mental health nurse on an acute mental health ward in Manchester. Working on the wards, he saw a huge need to improve the quality and safety of them. At a young age, very quickly, he was in charge of an entire ward of around 20 very unwell patients. These experiences led him to become passionate about improving the way mental health care is delivered to patients. He went on to complete both a Masters of Science in Psychosocial Interventions and an MPhil which investigated the attitudes that mental health nurses working on acute wards have towards their patients. He then went on to become one of the first mental health nurses to be awarded a prestigious Health Foundation Fellowship to undertake a PhD investigating Pro-Renata or PRN medication on wards. For those of you who don't know, this is the medication that isn't given routinely, but is given as and when it's needed. Since then, John has been awarded over £8 million in grant funding to support his research and has published over 100 peer-reviewed publications. John is now based at the University of Leeds and holds an adjunct professorship at the University of Southern Denmark. I have also had the great pleasure of working with John on several projects, and I can attest to his great passion for improving mental health services and his personal commitment to this work. Professor John Baker, welcome to Humans of Clinical Academia. Today we are doing the podcast over a flat white, which is your coffee of choice. Have you always been a flat white drinker?
Probably for about 20 years. Quite a long time. First tried it in Australia.
I was going to say, I didn't think flat whites existed until about 5 years ago, but no, you found them somewhere else.
Found them somewhere else.
Great choice. And were you a coffee drinker before that?
Not really, no. Didn't find coffee till probably my late 20s, 30s.
Wow. Tea drinker?
No, just soft drinks, water.
Wow. That's incredible. Okay. So let's start today with your current work into improving the safety of mental health care settings for patients. Why is this work necessary?
I think you only have to look at a newspaper most weeks to see examples of the harm caused to people when they're really unwell and really distressed. You know, the iatrogenic institutional harm that people experience. It may be that the media report on it more now than maybe in the past. But actually, I think there's a real pressing need, and I think we're not seeing much improvement in the treatment and the care of people when they're acutely unwell in probably the last 30, 40, 50 years.
In terms of the work you're doing, trying to research and push this area forwards, what are the challenges you come across?
I think it's definitely a challenge of workforce. I think you're seeing staff on wards, registered nurses being replaced with less qualified, less experienced staff. I think it's an area where actually the workforce isn't probably very well looked after, so they leave very quickly. So you have young staff, like I was, left in charge of wards, maybe with less of a skill set now than they would have had. The curriculum's been watered down. And I don't think people intrinsically are any worse today than maybe they have been forever. But I think the nature of the reduction in beds, the reduction in community services, the reduction in third sector services mean that a population is more concentrated on a ward. On wards probably aren't designed with therapy in mind.
It's time for your first photo, which shows a policy document. John Baker, can you please tell us more about this?
So we were really lucky to collaborate with Sense About Science to go to Parliament to talk about some of the work we've done around reducing restrictive practices on wards, but also in prisons and children, young people's institutional settings. We know children's homes are a real problem at the moment in terms of dealing with distress, and the fact a lot of them are run by private companies that are more interested in profit than care. And this just felt like a moment in time where actually we went to Parliament to talk to MPs about trying to change the world, which I suppose is what everybody comes into the job to do.
Fantastic. I mean, that sounds incredible. So just going back a little bit, you started your mental health nursing career in 1996. What led you to become interested in mental health nursing specifically?
So I wasn't. Very early on in my B-nurse course, so I started in 92 on the Bachelor Nursing course, I was told by a ward sister I wouldn't make a good adult nurse because I spent too much time talking to the patients, which was quite bizarre feedback really for a young 18-year-old lad. But actually, once I started engaging my brain towards mental health, it kind of a light bulb went off. You know, I've been a terrible student up to that point, and it was just something that really captivated my brain. And actually, that's given me that desire to learn. I often say to students now, I only know 1% of what I need to know in order to be a good mental health nurse. And that, I suppose, that thing is something that's driven me all the time, is that thriving and learning and trying to understand another person's brain.
This leads us nicely onto our next photo, which shows a certificate. Can you tell us more about this?
So that's the certificate I got from the EMB, so that it no longer exists, just to prove that I'm a registered nurse. I mean, it was a moment in time. I think it's an important thing for me to actually enter onto that register, and the professionalism of being a nurse is something that I hold. There's a straight line there, you know, around my professional conduct and being a nurse.
What does ENB stand for?
So English National Board. So it was the people that regulated nursing before the NMC came along.
Wow, that's great to see. So, John Baker, let's go back right to the start. You were born in Portsmouth in the 70s and growing up in the 80s. What was that like?
I suppose it was kind of a weird experience. It's Portsmouth, Gosport's very military centred. So you had the Falklands War, you know, we watched the ships sail out, we watched the ships sail back. My dad was in the Navy. My mum was in the Navy, when she was a lot younger. So it was very weird growing up in a military town, quite a very conservative, small C conservative town. And I know a lot of friends and me struggled with that really. It was growing up in the Thatcher's era. It kind of feels a lot like the last 15 years really in terms of austerity.
Mm-hmm. You said just now that both of your parents were in the military, and you've mentioned to me earlier that they then went into nursing.
Yes, my mum was a Navy nurse, so in the Quans, and my dad joined the Navy as a rating, and then did his ODA, so his operating theatre training, and then he did his RMN, and then he obviously got promoted out of that. So there's kind of a healthcare background behind me.
How did that influence you? I mean, what did you see of their nursing careers? What was the impression you got of nursing at that time?
My mum was a practice nurse, so I suppose she was round the corner at a GP surgery, quite local. My dad moved out of nursing and then actually started to work in research. So we did a lot of stuff around cold water exposure and would go off to the Arctic Circle every winter.
Wow.
So a kind of a different field of healthcare, I suppose.
I have to ask, where in the Arctic Circle? That sounds amazing.
I never really know. Somewhere in North Norway.
So would you do skiing and things like that?
Yeah. So he used to teach. I think he used to teach the Royal Marines about Arctic survival and that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. So after nursing, mental health nursing for a few years, you decided to go back to uni and become a clinical academic or clinician who does research. Let's take a moment to review your next photo, which shows a journal article and a building.
So the journal article was the first paper ever published. I was still a nurse working on acute mental health wards. I was really lucky at that time to get on a master's, which was kind of around CBT, so cognitive behavioural therapy for psychosis. Not many nurses on acute wards were doing that stuff. It was very much around community CBT and actually trying to translate CBT into something that was workable with somebody that was acutely psychotic was a real challenge, which I really enjoyed. And the first paper was an essay that I wrote on that course that the tutor encouraged me to publish, which really surprised me because English has never been my strong suit.
So you published this article, and what was that like at the time? What was the process?
So in those days, you used to type it up and put it in an envelope and send it to the journal, and then they would write back to you, formally write back to you with amendments, and you'd send it back. And then when it was published, they used to send it to you, the printed copy. It's very different today. Everything's done by email, isn't it? And you get a PDF if you're lucky. But it felt a real moment when it arrived in the post. I think it's an important thing to recognise these steps that we take, and that was certainly the first step. Strangely enough, that first paper was talking about changing the nature of acute mental health nursing from reactive firefighting towards providing proactive care, which you can see all the way through to today's projects that I'm running.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also a building in this photo. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the building is it's Coupland 3 at the University of Manchester. So obviously I was there as a student, and that was the building I came back to do my PhD in. And I think there was a room there, I think it was called C8, where there was lots of PhD students and early career researchers, and it was a real melting pot of ideas and knowledge. And it was around the time I was doing my PhD, and it has a monumental kind of impact on me as a place and a moment in time.
How do you think that compares to the experiences that PhD students have today?
It's probably a million miles away, isn't it? I think we try really hard to co-locate people in a room. I think it's the conversations you have around research over coffee, over meal times, about how to do X and how to do Y. I think buildings and universities have moved away from that a lot. Discussion is part of our lifeblood, really. I think we don't discuss things enough.
Yeah, definitely. Remote working has changed a lot of the experience, I think, for all of us, but I think it can especially impact PhD students. Okay, so let's move on to your work in public engagement. You have written 37 blog posts for the Mental Health blog. You run your own blog, and you also have over 5,000 followers on X. What led you to want to communicate science in this way?
So I think my early engagement with Twitter, it was a very different time, and Andre, who runs the Mental Health, really changed my perception of how you engage with the public and clinicians around the things that we do. And I think there's a community of people out there that you don't necessarily get in institutions that help you to push your research further. They connect you, they give you new ideas. The Mental Health is great because it takes academic papers, which are terribly written and very dry a lot of the time, and translates them into things that people can access and read as a starting point, but also as a really great way of keeping up to date with the evidence base. I mean, papers are just churned out for fun these days. But I always try and get my students to read an ELF blog a week because it keeps you vibrant, it keeps you thinking, it keeps you growing.
Has anything surprised you through this work that you've done, kind of communicating your research to lay audiences?
No, I think it's surprising now how hard it has become. You feel like you're having to, be on Blue Sky and X if you want to stay on X, and LinkedIn. There's just Facebook. There's loads more mechanisms by which you do it, but actually, I suppose your voice gets watered down. I've had some quite interesting conversations with people about my research on Twitter. Sometimes it feels like there's a pile on, other times it feels incredibly supportive, but at least people are communicating, and I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you come across any challenges while you've been writing blog posts and tweeting? You mentioned a pile on just then. Have there been any moments where you've thought, I don't want to do this anymore?
Yeah, daily moments. No, I think that there's been a few markers where I've actually thought, what am I doing? You know, when I've been trying to engage on Twitter with somebody that's unhappy, where there's other things going on in my life, you know, things going on in the family, things going on at home, and you think, why am I investing all my energy here when actually there's a life outside of work that's more important?
Actually, that leads really nicely onto our next photo, which shows a picture of a karate belt. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, I suppose it's a curveball photo in it, but I think I learned very early on in my academic career about sustainability. I worked with somebody that would, on a good Friday evening, would quite happily be sending emails to 4 o'clock in the morning. And actually, this is a job. It's an unfair job in lots of ways, because the successful people work more hours than you will ever work. But I made that choice to boundary my working time and invest energies in my family and my wife, but also in terms of other activities. So in my 30s, it was all about karate. In my 40s, it became all about scuba diving. I don't know what my 50s will hold. I probably need another hobby.
So this karate belt, I don't know much about karate, but it looks to me like a black belt.
Yes, yeah.
So it sounds like you have really gone the distance and became very skilled in that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it took a long time to get to that level. I trained at the Manchester University Karate Club when I was a PhD student and followed that through. So I'd quite often go and train Tuesdays and Thursdays after work, but it made me leave work, you know, at a reasonable time. It kept me fit and healthy. But actually, I think you've got to, when you're thinking all the time, you've got to do other things.
So it took your mind off. It was a distraction from the other pressures in your life.
I think you do your better work when you've got some headspace.
To get some perspective.
Yeah.
And you mentioned scuba diving as well. Can you tell us a bit more about that? To me, the idea of scuba diving is terrifying. So I'd be really curious to hear about your experiences.
So I tried scuba diving in Australia many years ago. It's something I came back to. And then actually I'd done a lot of diving around the UK. So in very cold, dark, dingy water. Again, it's just something that when you're immersed in water and you're diving, actually your mind is my mind just goes blank. I can live in the moment, which I just find really helpful and healthy. I suppose it's a bit like what you're seeing around the emergence of cold water swimming, isn't it? When you're doing stuff, you just need that headspace sometimes, I think.
You have blogged and posted about facing challenges in winning grant funding in terms of grants to support research projects. What are some of the challenges that you've faced?
So I think my frustration is the amount of money I see invested into research. You know, mental health at the moment is probably getting more money ploughed into it than I've ever known. You know, you're actually seeing calls for mental health nursing research. But some of that always feels like funders don't think outside the box sometimes. So they'll quite happily fund yet another trial of CBT, you know, in this version or that version, you know, and there's been hundreds of trials of CBT funded. When you add them all together, they don't seem to make much difference, and that's because they don't pay any attention to the workforce that delivers CBT routinely. But funders are always after the next shiny new thing, emperor's new clothes. They invest very little money in the day-to-day reality. So, you know, what's it like when you're visited by a crisis team? Why can't we research that to make things better? Why can't we spend lots of money making acute mental health wards better in terms of patient outcomes? So you see funders put out these calls and they either never fund things, or in my mind they fund the wrong things, largely because they're not funding my thing. But I think there's a real need to fund applied health research, not just the shiny next thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Despite these challenges, you have still accrued a portfolio of over £8 million in grant funding. So you have overcome this challenge, at least to a pretty decent extent. How have you managed that?
I've learned a lot about getting grants, so you work with some senior people, they teach you, it's formulaic. I think there's a certain patter you've got to have in a grant application in order to speak to the scientists in the room. I think you've got to make a convincing argument that it's topical and it's important clinically. I think there's ways that people can write applications that make them accessible. Most funding panels only really kind of read your lay summary. There's only one or two people on a panel may go into detail. So you've got to capture that attention very early and in a very lay way.
What advice would you give to nurse researchers setting out on the journey of trying to win funding?
I think nursing has a hard time to get research funding. I chair a funding panel for the NHR. Nursing's always underrepresented in both applications, but also in terms of the quality of the applications they put in. I think nursing dumbs itself down quite a lot from undergraduate level all the way through. I think we don't teach nursing students the language that they need around health services research. I don't think we push them in the right way in terms of knowledge gain. We don't help them with their writing, for example, and we don't wrap people around them in terms of grant applications. Good grant applications need to be supported by good methodologists, not just other nurses.
Mm-hmm. It's time for our last photo, which shows a beautiful building and a name tag, which says Professor John Baker. Can you tell us more about this photo?
Yeah, so when I moved to Leeds, it was a great opportunity for me at a time when my career felt challenging. I wasn't having the best of time in the place I was working at before that. And when I arrived at Leeds, on my door was that scrappy bit of plastic with a scratch in it, but somebody had taken the time to write my name on a piece of plastic and stick it to my door. And I'm forever grateful to the person that did that, because actually it enabled me to let go of some baggage and move forward with my life. And little things like that, the first paper publication arriving through the post. If you look at the paper, it had my old home address on it, which just shows how naive I was. To a little bit of plastic stuck on a door. They're the things that make a difference in your career. And it's important you hold on to those things. They're hard won, and they're really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, John Baker, as we mentioned earlier, you have published over 100 research articles. I think a lot of healthcare professionals who are thinking about research or interested in getting into research feel fearful of getting into writing journal articles. We hear a lot about imposter syndrome. Was this anything you ever struggled with?
Probably every day.
Even now?
Even now. And it sounds strange. I don't feel like I fit in as an academic. I can remember an English teacher telling me I was rubbish and I'd never amount to anything. I still, to this day, struggle with writing. So I think, you can write loads. It's not an easy thing. There's some things I've learned along the way about very short sentences, cutting to the chase, that I think are really important and help you write papers, particularly when you don't know what a verb is. And actually, we don't teach students the right way to write. We teach them about volume. So we always set essays with 2,500 words. We never kind of talk about 2,500 good words. So that's something I kind of bring through into when I speak to students about writing. But everyday writing is a struggle. It gets a little easier over time, but it's something I've had to really work at.
I mean, that's kind of shocking for me to hear, to be honest, that you would still have imposter syndrome despite all of your academic achievements. I guess maybe the good news for people who are setting out who have imposter syndrome is that it's possible to be so successful even if that imposter syndrome remains. What tips would you give people for managing imposter syndrome?
I don't think I manage it in my own brain very well, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to give tips. You kind of treat each day as a new day. I suppose part of the reason why I vent so much on Twitter is me letting go of some of this stuff that otherwise I'd just be carrying around my as bags all the time. You have some wins, you have a lot more losses, I think, in academia. And, you know, some of that is about understanding that it's a game. It's a very tribal game. You can often feel like you're not in the right tribes, or you trust in people and they let you down. So find good people that you can trust in, and they trust in you, and keep working at those kind of relationships because they're really important. Don't take rejection personally, although I always do. Reviewers are just like you. They might be having a bad day. They might not know what they're talking about. They're trying to help you, and sometimes there's bits of that you can take and just say, "Oh, okay, that was useful. I'll think about that again." Being reflective, I think, is quite helpful. But switching your computer off at the end of the day and doing something else is equally good.
That's great advice. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our interview today. John Baker, thank you so much for joining us. To our listeners, thank you so much for choosing to join us for Humans of Clinical Academia. This is a Manchester Catalys podcast. Manchester Catalys is a partnership between the University of Manchester and Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust, and we are grateful for their support, which made this recording possible. I'd also like to thank my Manchester Catalys colleagues, and especially Umang Sinha for production and editing.